got a pleasing diversity of responses on first inspection. Some people absolutely saying nothing. Repeated reference to splendid isolation or isolationism on the part of the United States. So a bit late in helping. We've got kind of people talking about the emergence of an American empire. The League of Nations, Wilson, very interesting. A couple of people noticed referencing saying we wouldn't have won without them. So we've got a juxtaposition between the belief of America being very late to the party, but at the same time America at least having some sort of a very important role in the conflict. Okay, so somebody's put Captain America as well. There we go. Lusitania, very excellent. Yeah. All right. Okay. Right. Brilliant. Thank you very much. What we'll do, this is going to be a basis for comparison because we'll do this at the end as well and see if there's anything that you feel has been a benefit to your attending today. So thank you very much. Without further ado, then, I'll pass you over to esteemed colleague, Dr. Christopher Fuller, who works in modern American foreign policy and specialising in important matters such as drone warfare, counter-intelligence, counter-insurgency, and the war on terror. Today, he's going to be bringing it back historically, putting that into a deeper historical context with this talk, The Great War and the Roots of Modern America.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just start. If somebody will click it and move slides, but if we pause and nothing's moving, it's because I've just noticed that battery light is flashing on here because my son has found this. He wants to use this with the cat. And obviously he's been at it for quite a while because they were new batteries for the new semester. So what I want to talk about here, really this idea of the traditional historiography and narrative is that the Second World War is really this moment that transforms the United States. And that its role in the Second World War and then the move into the Cold War is really when the United States takes on this role of global leadership. But what I want to suggest here is that actually the roots of all of that are in the First World War. But as quite rightly mentioned here, isolationism, this period that follows, means that people just haven't associated that. There's such a disconnect between the role in the First World War and the role in the Second, and what happens in between, this isolationism of the United States, that it's not seen as the impact of World War I leading onto and into the events of the Cold War. And what I want to suggest is, actually it's all there. All the changes occur, they're just dormant. And then they emerge. They're not created by World War II, they re-emerge. So I want to kind of discuss a number of things to kind of show that. I want to talk briefly about democracy promotion, the connection between the League of Nations and the United Nations, military expansion, economic strength, the emergence of the national security state, the United States as a national security state, and then kind of wrap that up with a few conclusions. So if we start with this idea of democracy promotion. Now, upon the United States' late entry into the First World War, General Pershing led a parade of troops through France, through Paris, and they visit the grave of Gilbert de Motier, or the Marquis de Lafayette, or just known as Lafayette to the Americans. And upon arriving at this, now Pershing gets credit for this statement, but it wasn't. It was actually his aide, Charles Stanton, and he stated, Lafayette, we are here. Now this was a publicity exercise. This was very deliberate. The press was invited and a show was made of the arrival at this homage, this tomb. It was for domestic consumption, American domestic consumption, but also more widely for international consumption. And it was about showing the motives for American entry into this war. Now prior to this visit, the narrative, the discussions around US policymakers after the First World War was one of a war between nations. This was one of the reasons that the United States couldn't really involve itself, in that the worry was that the peoples of the United States were drawn from many of those nations on all sides of the war. So rather than seeing their own citizens as Americans, there was this concern that their citizens might be French, might see themselves as German as an origin, might see themselves as Irish, might see themselves as British, and that actually the United States was spread in terms of its interests across Europe for this war. And here you can see Wilson talking about the United States must be neutral, it must be impartial, because it doesn't want to be seen that it's construed as a preference for one party over another. So in 1914, the view of this war was that this was a war between parties. But as you get repeated attacks in which American citizens perish, mostly the U-boat campaign, this is really what's racking up the American casualties and causing increased frustration at home, when eventually, after the Zimmerman telegram emerges, revealing this plot between the German government, or an attempted plot between the German government and the Mexican government to attack the United States, then, when Wilson declares war, we see a shift in the kind of language. So no longer is this about parties, nations. This is now about ideas. This is not a war between Germany and Britain and the United States. This is a war about the security for democratic governments around the world. So here you can see Wilson, we are accepting this challenge of hostile purpose because we know that in such government, following such methods, the German government is talking about, we can never have a friend. And in that presence, in its organised power, there can be no assured security for democratic governments of the world. We are now about to accept gauge of battle with this natural foe to liberty. So this is very different language here. This language, of course, you can see this carries on into the Cold War. This is the exact sort of language. This carries on into the 1991 Gulf War. This carries on into the 2003 invasion of Iraq. This is the standard discourse for American intervention now. This fight is the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its people, the German peoples included, for the rights of nations great and small and the privilege of man everywhere, to choose their way of life and obedience. The world must be made safe for democracy. So, this has shifted. And by visiting the grave of Lafayette, the American government was very clearly aligning their intervention in this war with the views of the Founding Fathers. This was about freedom, liberty, and democracy. This was not about siding with one European power over another European power. This is now an ideological conflict. So here's Lafayette meeting Washington. Lafayette was a key figure in the revolution. He travelled, despite his aristocratic roots in France. He hated autocracy. He valued personal liberty. He left France, he joined the revolutionaries, he would travel back to France to gather more support, and eventually played a role in the revolution in France itself. So, this is shifting the war into one of democracy promotion. Now that also ties into the ideas of the League of Nations. This is one of the most famous images in pretty much every history textbook in the country that ever discusses the interwar years. Has this image of the United States sitting out, the keystone of the League of Nations. Wilson's idea that in order to prevent further wars, you must have this concert of nations working together. And actually, its opponents, so while Wilson might have cited the Founding Fathers to say this is about the defence of liberty, his opponents also cited the Founding Fathers, in this case Jefferson. So Senator William Borah was the leader of a group of senators that were against ratifying the Treaty of Versailles and agreeing to the League of Nations. They opposed it and were able to defeat Wilson's government on 3 occasions. And what they argued here is that they must not engage in entangling alliances. Jefferson had spoke about the founding of this nation, that this would be a friend to all, an enemy to none, and not engaged in entangling alliances with any other nations. So going back to the words of the Founding Fathers. Now, that idea of this is where isolationism comes from. We won't be allied, we won't be allied. And the Republicans used this in the 1920 presidential campaign. You might recognise this slogan. This is Warren Harding's slogan, America First. And what he talks about, you have a recession that hits the United States because the war boom economy comes to an end. And there is a recession that hits the United States. And the Republicans falsely blame this upon Wilson, his policies, international interventionism, and talks about a return to normalcy. So it's a populist campaign. You can have life like it was before. The truth is, the United States has transformed, the world has transformed, but there is just a flat denial of this. It's not based, isolationism isn't based in reality, it's based in populism. That's what this is all about. This is a populist slogan. America first, you first, don't worry about responsibilities. And it works, it chimes with the American public. That combined with the fact that the Republicans outspend the Democrats 4-1, you see an enormous Republican landslide here. And this is what ushers in this era of isolationism. But if you look here, the running mate to James Cox, who's so soundly beaten here, is Franklin Roosevelt. And during this period, Franklin Roosevelt stumps more than 800 times in defense of the League of Nations. He goes all around the United States. It becomes one of the key parts of this campaign, with the Republicans basically holding up saying, vote for the Democrats and you'll get more interventionism, and the Democrats trying to defend the idea. And during this time, Roosevelt transforms his ideas. He sees that this is, it does not, in its current form, in the high-minded way that Wilson wanted the League of Nations to work, it is not accepted by the American public. And so this sound defeat shapes Roosevelt's mind to the point where, when he then approaches stability after World War II and the introduction of his idea, the United Nations, he is what Brinkley and Hoops describe a disenchanted Wilsonian idealist. He is willing to negotiate, he is willing to work with Congress, he's willing to allay the American public's fears that they will become global policemen and that this will be a shared burden. And the League of Nations, the United Nations, sorry, is what it is because of the defeat of the League of Nations and because of Roosevelt's specific role in that. So while that defeat might have temporarily led to isolationism, it did also sow the seeds of a successful introduction of the United Nations and getting Congress to ratify that, getting the American public behind that approach. Now the military expansionism, well, this is fairly straightforward in some ways. Of course, the United States military grows. It grows dramatically during this period. So when World War I was declared, the United States had a military of around about 200,000 men, of which 2/3 were regulars and 1/3 was the National Guard. Now the National Guard got sent down to the Mexican border, and they policed that border, but we see enormous growth in the actual military. So that it grows by over 20 times its size over that period. So the United States might not join the war until late, but its military growth is exponential. So by the end of the war, over 4 million Americans have served, 2 million of those in France, and 1.3 million of those in active combat. So you actually get a large number of veterans. And this isn't just about the fact that American citizens are involved in combat, but also this is now your new officer corps. These are your leaders. Those that see combat here become the mentors to the next generations. Eisenhower, Marshall, they are mentored by men that gain their martial experience in the fields, the battlefields of Europe. And so this begins the martial learning and expansion of the Americans. It's not just about numbers, it's about experience and ideas. In particular to that is air power. Now, despite what is described by Bert Franson as the air-mindedness of the American people, they understood flight and aircraft and what it meant. This was very much civilian. So, you know, the Wright brothers, of course, right? It's the home of the aircraft. And the Americans understood this, but not in a military sense. When the American military joined the war, their air force was dramatically inferior to that of the European nations. They had one signal branch, so a reconnaissance squadron. That was it. That's all the United States had. But very shortly after joining the war, Congress passed a $640 million appropriation bill, the largest bill for a single purpose ever passed by that point, and its single purpose was the military expansion of American air power. Now, when we think of the United States and military power, it is synonymous with air power. Whether we're talking about bombing campaigns over Syria, or we're talking about the launching of cruise missiles, or we're talking about strategic bombers flying over North Korea, or we're thinking of drones and unmanned aircraft. Air power is the absolute cornerstone of American military power. Well, it's that investment there. That's where it began. Up until that point, military air power didn't even feature in American strategic thinking. By the end of the war, the American Expeditionary Force has 14 groups, 7 observation groups, 5 pursuit, so dogfighting, and 2 bombardment. But the real growth is domestic. It's at home. It's the growth of an air force for future wars. What's serving over in France is only 40% of the US Air Force. By the time the war ends, the US Air Force, what's been created in the United States itself, there are 190,000 men and 11,000 aircraft. That's in the space of 2 years. So US air power has its roots in World War I. And again, like with the military, it's not until 1947 it gets a separate branch, the US Air Force, but again, it's about the way of thinking. American airmen return with experience of how aircraft can be used in future battles. And this is where strategic doctrine of American air power begins to emerge. And even in the late 1930s, when Roosevelt was discussing how the United Nations will work, he talks about the use of the Air Force in policing actions, in exactly the way that we see it used by the United States today. So for example, when the Assad regime used chemical weapons, Trump's response was to use cruise missiles against it. Actually, Roosevelt is talking about this idea in the 1930s, that you could use standoff air power as a way of policing the world, and that's coming out of the strategic doctrine that grows from World War I. In terms of the casualties, the Americans are spared the worst traumas of the war. While the casualty figures themselves are significant, over 100,000, in percentage terms, this does not in any way have the same devastating impact and create the same anti-war feelings that you see elsewhere. The French casualties, for example, 73% casualty rate. The United States having an 8% casualty rate, and of those, about half of those are from illness, pneumonia. The actual traumas of warfare, the American public are spared this in a major way. And that creates a different perception of warfare and combat. It isn't seen as futile, as much of a meat grinder as it's seen amongst the European nations. So they have a greater concept of strength and optimism, and of the institutions of their military and what it can achieve. And participation in this victory created a cohesiveness and a confidence amongst them. And that's probably best seen, the patriotism that comes out in American culture. In particular, Tin Pan Alley, the songs that come out of there. Irving Berlin himself, a great sign of, deeply, deeply patriotic. Himself having fled anti-Semitic pogroms in Russia, having come to America as a poor immigrant, but then having the American dream, having become extremely famous and wealthy through his songwriting. And I'll play you a short clip, actually, of Let's All Be Americans Now, because the lyrics of this give you a real sense of what this confidence that comes out of the military conflict really is.
Now then, Father, in the
a destiny, right? They have not sought this war, but if this war exists, this is an American responsibility to go deal with it. And this lines up with the language that Wilson was using, the visit to Lafayette's grave. This is a manifest destiny of the United States to defend democracy. The Founding Fathers would expect it. And that comes through that popular culture, that permeates through American society. And we see it. So while isolationism might give this sense that Americans all just America first and self-interested, actually that wasn't the case. The war had changed the American psyche and this idea of responsibility, especially amongst important elites. So for example, Henry Luce, the important publisher in the United States, the owner of Time and Life and Fortune magazine, wrote this op-ed article in Life magazine in 1941 in which he berated the American public for not having realized that the United States has become the most powerful and most vital nation in the world. This is pre its entry into World War II. It already is the most powerful and most vital nation, he's argued. It became that way as a result of World War I. But it's failed to play its part as a world power by accepting this populist, laissez-faire drivel of the Republican Party. He extols the American public must accept wholeheartedly the duty and opportunity as the most powerful and vital nation in the world to exert upon the world the full impact of our influence for such purposes as we see fit. This has its roots in the confidence that emerges from the First World War. The economic strength here, well, I don't really need to say a whole lot on this because essentially the statistics speak for themselves. You can see industrial production dramatically rises. Government revenues, the government is transformed into a big, something that can really shape American society, that's deeply, deeply engaged with American society. Of course you see the drop-off afterwards, but the point, this is what I mean about these changes are dormant afterwards. The American government has proven that it can manage the economy. Massive spending into the Army and the Navy, huge growth in the gross national product of the United States. They actually, they benefit from this war. They make profit from this war. First, from the years of standoff and trade, but then from the reorganisation of the domestic economy. It creates wealth for them. And the labour market grows. Now, how does that labour market grow? Well, we'll get into that, who the additional labour market is, but we see the government playing a big role in mobilisation here. So the Food and Fuel Control Act, the government takes responsibility of overseeing the production, the supply and the distribution of food and fuel products. The rail networks are terribly congested at the beginning of the war. They can't move the goods and the troops around, so the government takes control and organises the rail networks, makes them much more efficient, pours money in, reforms the rail networks. Then we do things like the War Industries Board that basically explores links between industry and military needs and begins dishing out those defence contracts that are now such a vital part of the US economy. Well, this is where it's born. Government management of the defence industry. Where do those extra workers come from? Well, it's internally transformed. American women being penetrating into the traditional blue-collar jobs that were only the roles of men, migration of workers from farmland into the industrial cities in the north, black workers. So in terms of the impact upon women, by August 1920 we see the 19th Amendment that grants suffrage to Americans, and that migration of black workers into the north also plays a significant role in the civil rights struggles that will come. So internally this transforms the United States, but politically as well. And the last part I want to kind of talk about as a root here is the national security state. So traditionally we see this as something that emerges in 1947 under Truman with the introduction of the National Security Act, a new way of thinking about the United States. This term, national security, becoming a very powerful term that allows you to do all sorts of things domestically. The Patriot Act, for example, surveillance of US citizens, or the creation of the CIA and intervention in countries abroad as part of your national security. Well, actually, the Espionage Act is really the birth of that idea of the American government taking great control. If you think about the importance of the First Amendment and free speech in the United States, this is an extremely controversial law passed by Wilson here. Its use on Eugene Debs, the Union Socialist Party leader, delivers a speech in June 1918 urging resistance to the draft. He is labelled a traitor to the nation by Wilson and arrested and jailed for that. He actually runs for president in 1920 from jail. Now, his sentence, he's eventually sentenced to commuted by Harding, but he doesn't receive a pardon. And this is the same piece of law, same piece of legislation that was used for Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden after their leaks. So this is still around today. But this is where it's introduced. In 1917, this idea that the American government will control what you say, and if it is deemed that it's in threat of the national security, then First Amendment rights are trumped by that. This is the birth of a very muscular government that will control its populace. So, my four kind of key conclusions here. Number one, the economic position of the United States is transformed. It goes from being a debtor nation into a creditor nation. And the centre of economic power shifts from London to New York. It's a combination of the bonus, the strength of the US economy combined with the damage to European economies. And those two compound to just shift the balance there. The government's management of the economy transforms the way American public see the government. Now, you might get a period of isolationism afterwards, but when crisis next hits in the Great Depression, those lessons are picked up. The New Deal is, in a sense, that idea of massive management. In fact, Roosevelt asks for war powers. He specifically asks, he declares a war on poverty. A war on the Depression, and he asked for war power. So he is going back to the lessons of 1917, 1918, where the government took control and transformed the domestic economy. And the same lessons roll into post-war planning. So the creation of the United Nations, Bretton Woods as a new economic model for the world, the formation of NATO. These things are done through big government. And that's a lesson learned there. The growth of confidence in the American public, the lyrics of Irving Berlin there, this idea, the American-centric essay by Henry Luce, this idea of this is America's mission, this is all tied in with the narrative around we are defending democracy, Lafayette, we are here. Right? And that carries on, and despite isolationism, there are those that say this is our responsibility, and when the Second World War emerges, they were able to pick up that narrative and push it back to the American people and say, remember, we are not isolationists, this is who we are. And so, my last point here, by having raised its standard to defending democracy, the United States essentially guaranteed that it was going to join the Second World War. It would be impossible to go back on these ideals of the Founding Fathers at this point. It was a matter of when, not if. And by setting itself up as the defender of democracy, this is actually where the roots of the Cold War really are. Because this war also transforms Imperial Russia. And when the Soviet Union emerges, the United States, having set itself up as a global defender of democracy, is now on a path for an ideological conflict with what becomes the Soviet Union from this same war. So hopefully you can see, hopefully this has convinced you to some extent that actually World War II is perhaps less transformative than we've traditionally seen, and that despite isolationism, the US is a dormant global empire, global power, waiting, and that the American public are duped for a decade by populist talk of America first. But what they do is actually return back to the values of World War I. Now there's, I can see we have 5 minutes, 4 minutes. So if there are, I'm happy to take any questions. Yes?
I was very surprised that you did say that they promoted air power in the First World War quite quickly. I thought it was the other way around. And there was one eminent military person called Billy Mitchell, and he was taken to court for promoting the ideal of air power. You may have something to say about that.
Yes, well, I mean, you're absolutely. It's an interesting story in that there are only a handful of people that actually do this. There are a handful of advocates for American adoption of air power. Air power is deeply controversial at this point. It's one of the first areas that there has been international agreement on in terms of conventions around protections of civilians. Pre-World War I, with this realization that the likes of Zeppelins could easily target civilians. And so for some politicians and warfighters, this is an extremely dangerous route to go down because of its obvious engagement with civilians and civilian casualties and targeting of cities and so on. But for me, it's the fact that Congress ultimately signed off, within months of declaring war, the largest appropriations bill ever. And the wording of that bill, it is specific. That money is for military expansion of the Air Force. Now, that doesn't remove the ideological conflicts. There are still those who think this is a bad idea. But my suggestion was this is about the American government. The American government came on board with the idea. In the military, there are still those that absolutely are deeply opposed to the use of air power. But Wilson and Congress see this as a future. And so the arguments are, they're strategic, they're ideological about whether this is dishonourable, is it not chivalrous to engage from the air? Will it lead you down a path of targeting civilians? But ultimately, Wilson and Congress signing off on that, to me, shows that is the moment they embrace air power.
Was there any conflict morally in terms of taking the position of being world advocates on democracy and the pre-1418 position where actually the USA had been colonised in places like the Philippines, Cuba, and one or two others? It's sort of slightly hypocritical, perhaps.
Yes, so Wilson is very careful in the speech that I had the little extract from here. He is very careful. He does go on to say very specifically, we do not seek territory, we do not seek ground, we do not seek economic gain. So yes, there are those that absolutely see this as, wait a minute, we're engaging in rich man's war here. This is why you see the Espionage Act introduced. This is why they've set us up in prison, because that criticism is very real, and it does have supporters. And the US government realizes this, and rather than... So Wilson engages with it, typically as he does, in a high-minded, idealistic manner here. In this speech, he tries to say, this is not about territory, this is about free will of individuals. But the fact that you then back it up with a piece of legislation that allows you to lock up critics and anti-war campaigners shows that, yes, there was support for this, absolutely.
Yeah.
And they're worried about that, especially the draft. The draft is, for some, they absolutely get the jingoistic, let's go and do our bit. But yeah, there are others. And, when Irving Berlin writes that song, that's his war contribution. Right? He's been drafted. So he writes that song. As part of it. So they are very, very deliberately using propaganda to promote this war. So they know that there is a controversy to this. So yes, you're absolutely right, and they don't all buy into it, but the government uses its levers of power. Soft power in terms of culture and propaganda posters and lyrics and songs and so on, and then hard power in the Espionage Act. And if they can't convince you, then they'll silence you.
Roughly what percentage of the American population was made up of people who come from the nations of the Triple Alliance?
I don't know.
What percentage of the population would have been rooting for Germany?
Well, they do. I mean, yeah, quite a lot. And again, the fact that it's in the lyric,
yeah,
and it's kind of tucked in there, or Germany, right at the end. But yeah, it is a definite matter of concern. But this is again the reason that you pivot away from the idea of this being a conflict of nation states. The best way around that is to raise this to something higher. Because regardless of where your sympathies might lie, ultimately, you're talking about the Constitution now. You're talking about the Founding Fathers. So regardless, and that's why, again here, if you look at the language, the liberation of its peoples, the German peoples included.
Yes.
So this is a war against the authoritarian government, not German peoples, for exactly that reason. You're talking about a sizable proportion of your population, but they're very careful to try to separate that out. And again, you see this in the Second World War, of course, with Japanese citizens and internment camps. Right? The United States can't get around this issue. So it's something that they are conscious of. They have to think about when drafting this speech. They're having to include language on this. This is for the good of the German people. Don't oppose us on this. It's definitely a concern.
Just as a dual national, American and Brit, we were taught in the American school I attended that English was only just adopted by one vote over German as the national language of the United States with the founding fathers. So I think that puts it in perspective.
Yes. Yeah.
Could you just comment on the rise of naval power? Because they didn't seek to gain land, but they sure as hell controlled the seas.
Absolutely. So again, in one of the reasons when Wilson is talking about with Congress why they should enter this in his so this isn't a public speech, but in his notes to Congress, he talks about free trade and the movement, and that it is the United States' responsibility to make sure that the sea lanes are open access, and that this is vital for American trade. And I think the fact that I didn't have the exact statistics in here of American exports versus imports, but I took them out because it was kind of way too much. But they shift from something like $2.2 billion of exports in 1914 to $9.2 billion by 1920. And that is partly to do with this idea, look, we want to be a major producing and exporting nation, and the sea lanes are absolutely vital in that. So he doesn't use that one so much for the public, but when he's trying to persuade Congress to vote for the war, he absolutely talks about we need naval power to police the seas. And again, that is probably one of the core, if we talk about a Pax Americana, a kind of American peace and empire, that is probably the cornerstone of it now. The United States guarantees free movement across the maritime domain of shipping and so on. This is one of the challenge of the Chinese islands, or non-islands, created islands, the aptly named Mischief Island. This is why this is seen as a real challenge to the post-war order, because the United States essentially says we will guarantee navigation rights. But yes, Wilson absolutely is talking about that in 1917 as something that they must do. I think I'm probably...
You've gone round on 5 minutes.
Oh, sorry. Thanks for keeping me on the spot. Yes?
How significant do you think the arms race between Britain and France was for America developing its own naval power?
Sorry, they can't hear down front.
How significant do you think the arms race between Britain and France was in helping America develop its own naval power?
Okay, so that was how significant was the arms race between Britain and France in helping the United States develop its own naval power? Well, in any arms race, it's going to be extremely significant, because ultimately, if your goal is to guarantee protection and movement, then that's setting the benchmark, isn't it? That's where you need to be in order to achieve that goal. So, in short, hugely significant in that they're setting this is where you need to be if you want to be the dominant power, and you want to exercise this role for the good of all. This is the language Wilson uses, for the good of all. We will police the seas for the good of all. Then you need to make sure that you are the most dominant power. And again, they still do, right? I mean, 11 aircraft carriers.
But the American Sixth Fleet was developed to take away routes in the Mediterranean.
Right. Right, yes, yeah, absolutely. But again, with this sense of, this is for all of you, right? This is the power.
80, 90 years earlier.
Yes, so he's when he's talking to Congress about this isn't some out there idea. That everybody gets this. They all understand what he's talking about here and the importance of this with trade. But yeah, the arms race sets the benchmark. The US would probably have invested a lot less if it could have, but it has to. But as you saw, economically, this is good anyway. The production, for the, you know, that picture. Those are welders actually. They're working on the ships. These are the first female welders. These women, they're working on ship construction. So you know, this is ultimately, regardless of how much they must produce, this is transformative for the economy in a good way. The war was a competition of which system can produce the most, right? Resources were absolutely vital. This is why the Russian Imperial Russia does so badly, right? Its system is just so inefficient. The United States is forced into making its systems much more efficient. And there's nothing like an arms race and the need to produce massive amounts of munitions to make sure that your systems are deeply, deeply efficient. What I find interesting is it's the government, right? It's not the free market. Whenever it comes to the crunch, right, the government says, okay, we can do this for less and more efficiently. Despite this kind of constant worship, especially in the US, free market capitalism. I mean, the time that the United States basically nationalizes Silicon Valley would be really interesting. Right? But should there ever be a conflict with the likes of China or whatever, that's what you're talking about. Because the manufacture of chips and silicon, this will be the new steel. Right? And there's no way it will be left up to the free market.
Yes, actually one of the things I was continually thinking about while you were talking was the parallels between this and some of the changes going on during the American Civil War, 7 years earlier, and of course the emergence of the ironclads and shipping rather than the Air Force. However, what more interesting question is perhaps how did the Europeans perceive this at the time after the First World War? They must have recognised this emergence of a superpower, and they also must have recognised that they fundamentally could not compete with it. So how do you respond to that militarily?
Well, they do. I mean, militarily.
I mean, sorry. After the Civil War, which is why I mention it. Of course, Britain did develop ironclads and all the rest of it, and you know there was some scope for competition. But here, of course, after the First World War, there isn't.
No, and I'm not. I mean, I'm kind of. There may be people that would have a better answer to this, to be honest. But my interpretation of this would be really they lean on the League of Nations. You know, Britain and France in particular lean on the League of Nations as this kind of new form of power that it gives them. It's wrapped in this veil of authority and credibility that they use it for. If you look at the way they carve up their opponents, their defeated opponents, if you look at the way that you see the establishment of protectorates, essentially just extra colonies, right? They, rather than trying to match through military force, the League of Nations becomes this new political tool that they wield instead. And because of the United States' inability to be there and be a part of it, it becomes this kind of bastardized form of power wielding. So while they might not have the military power that they once had, and they might have lost a significant portion of their economic control, they do gain this new form of political power, which they abuse to the point where the League of Nations is seen, you know, as a joke almost. So I think that's my guess would be that's how they compensate. But there are probably other military decisions that are made that I don't know.
Right. Thank you, Robert. I think we owe Chris a debt of thanks, not least for wrestling here, a clicker away from his son. Providing us with a very clear and I think compelling case for continuity here between the First World War and what goes on later on. Thank you very much, Chris.